Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We are glad to have you with us. Week 1 is basically done. I'm here in Vegas, where last night we had an exciting top 25 matchup that gave us results that were at least an upset on paper. But Florida State and Boston College still have to play tonight. But after what happened in Ireland last week, I think the Noles will need a little bit more success to play themselves back into the discussion of college football survivors as we pare our list down. But before we get into this stuff, let me remind you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. But all of that said, week 1 is in the books. How are you feeling, Shehan?
I feel great. Look, the first Saturday, and especially like you said, we get 5 straight days of college football games, which is awesome and also a lot. It's a lot the first weekend when you're just like sitting down, keeping an eye on everything. You're going from, in Central Time, I'm going from basically 10 a.m. to like 1 a.m. Like it's a grind. It's a marathon, and it's the first one of the year. But I mean, it's great. I actually, even thinking back to last Thursday, sort of the first real games of week 1. We had like a decent week 0, but like week 1 is really when things get started. Like the Thursday Colorado game against North Dakota State, mixed with that Minnesota game that you were at against North Carolina. I mean, it just gets the juices flowing, right? Like it just gets things back. We were lucky to not just have a good week 0, but in these Thursday games, both of these major games were competitive. It was just a good week 1. And like you said, not necessarily a lot of upsets. The thing that's probably slightly disappointing to me is we only have one FCS over FBS, and that was a team in New Mexico that was actually an underdog against Montana State heading into that game, so not even an actual upset. Texas Tech tried to give us one against Abilene Christian. That's a fun story, by the way. Just a real quick aside. A lot of the players on that Abilene Christian team came from Texas Tech, including their quarterback Maverick McIver, because the head coach at Abilene Christian is former Texas Tech defensive coordinator Keith Patterson. Unfortunately, they weren't able to get it done in overtime. But overall, I still think it was a really good weekend. We got some fun narratives coming out that I think are going to stick with us for a while. And we got a tremendous amount of overreaction, especially after, by the way, that LSU versus USC game.
Oh, absolutely. I just have to say, credit to New Mexico. They almost pulled the upset. That was the thing. Even though we were talking about an FCS over FBS upset, for a while there, technically, they beat the spread. I love the fact that you could technically have a headline that, I think it was number 4, Montana State holds off upset bid by FBS New Mexico. What a world we live in, that's even possible. And of course, South Dakota State, well, they saw their, I believe, 39 game winning streak snapped to Oklahoma State. The number 1 Jackrabbits will probably still do great in FCS, but you can't win them all. Oklahoma State ended up looking fairly legit in their debut. But all of that said, I guess first things first, we are the College Football Survivor Show. We try, especially during the season, to open by kind of paring down our list of 12 teams, just to kind of quickly go over the teams we had initially for this. We had Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss, Penn State, Notre Dame, Utah, Missouri, Miami of Florida, Boise State. So from those teams, what are some of the candidates we have for potential elimination? Because we have to eliminate one. And there was no upset, so we have to kind of look a little bit deeper than just did they win or lose.
Yeah, and in fact, let's run back through, especially for first-time listeners, how this show works when we get into the season. So we have a list of 12 college football playoff contenders, and these are the teams that we think are legitimately in the field right now, who we think are the top contenders. I will say, we've worked with 12 in a 14 playoff before. We're gonna probably sit and tweak a little bit, try to figure out what makes the most sense for this new expanded college football playoff. But right now, these are the 12. And every single week, It's called the Survivor Show for a reason. We are required to vote off at least one team from our contender group. Now, sometimes, like you said, that's going to be obvious. A less educated show than the College Football Survivor Show might have had Florida State in their field heading into the year. Not us. We knew better than that. And that would have been an easy one to vote out after losing to Georgia Tech in week 1. Well, all 12 of the teams that are in our fields ended up winning. So we're going to have to get a little more creative with it. Now, we're instituting a couple of new rules when it comes to how we're putting together our 12 right now. We are required to have one from each of the major power conferences, and we're required to have one group of 5 team. So look, I put up a poll on our CFB Survivor Show Twitter/X accounts, and I said, out of these 4 teams, which one should be eliminated from our list of CFB contenders? Oregon, after only winning 24-14 against Idaho, a very weird game. Alabama, I just put them on. I don't know. No real good reason. Missouri was one of our last teams in, and then Boise State, which is our group of 5 representative. And by the way, they had a dogfight of a game against Georgia Southern. They didn't look amazing. I want people to understand, if you vote Boise State out because you're like, well, that's the worst team of the bunch, we're going to have to replace with another group of 5 team. We're not going to get to put Michigan in because you're voting out Boise State. That's not how any of this works, right? I get like on Twitter/X, like that's going to be confusing to some people, but we are required to have a group of 5 team in. Now, I won't tell you the results of that poll quite as yet, but I think that when you look at these 4 teams out of our 12, they were the ones who kind of stood out to me. Again, Alabama kind of just thrown on, but Oregon's really, really struggling in week 1. This is a team that we viewed as being in the top group of contenders heading into the season as a surefire, no doubt. Missouri, again, they had a pretty nice, I think it was a 51-0 victory over Murray State. Looked pretty good, but FCS opponent. Boise State, again, would we want to replace them with another team? And by the way, when we kick off a team, we open up a spot to vote on a team as well. So, Bobak, out of these 4 teams, who do you think we should vote off?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm going to go ahead and say with Mizzou and Alabama, I didn't see enough to make me worried. I mean, Mizzou, granted, they were a little lower on our list, but they did what they needed to do without any real problems. It was a tune-up game, which is why you have those. Kalen DeBoer's Alabama team looked solid in that 63-0 kind of blowout of Western Kentucky, as expected. And that wasn't an FCS team. Oregon, did they get lost in their own press clippings? That's all I can come up with, because Idaho, 14th ranked FCS team, but they were picked 3rd to finish in their conference. It's not even like we're talking about
are they Big Sky or are they?
They're Big Sky.
Okay, it's a good conference. It's a good conference.
But Oregon was a 44.5-point favorite. I mean, this got crazy, and I mean, I know a lot of Ducks fans were just happy people were paying attention to other games. They were happy no one was paying attention to them, because
they couldn't hide on the Pac-12 network anymore. Big Ten Network is available to the public, so I was able to turn it on.
What do you think went wrong there? What did it look like? Were they just out of sorts? I mean, I know there was a little bit of joking about, is Dylan Gabriel just kind of store-bought Bo Nix? What was your thought of all of this?
So I want to be clear, like, Dylan Gabriel played fine. Like, he played totally fine. 380, 2 touchdowns, 41 of 49. So they gave him a mix of short and long stuff to work with. That wasn't the issue. The issue was the offensive line. And the offensive line, apparently, we had heard some rumblings before, but they had some issues with injuries in fall camp. And apparently those issues are a lot worse than anybody realized, because they allow, in the first half, 3 sacks. For comparison, over the last 2 years, they allowed 10 total sacks in 2 seasons. So they've already basically almost matched their sack total from last season of 5 in 1 game. And then you also look at it, and again, some of this is obviously to do with sack adjustment, but Noah Whittington, their second string running back, 14 carries, 33 yards. That's terrible. Jordan James, 15 carries, 95 yards. He was able to muster 6 yards per carry. Didn't have one longer than 16. This doesn't look like an offensive line group that has a lot of depth. That's not something I expected. I mean, remember, this is a program that Mario Cristobal left, right? Like, and he left them stocked with good offensive linemen. Now, maybe they just get healthy, but while I think that there's not much reason to worry about Oregon in the regular season, this is a huge warning sign for me in terms of their ability to have the depth to make a playoff run. Like, I'm not saying that it's over or anything like that, but like, I think that Oregon showed more red flags than almost any other major contender. And you know what? Week 1 is the time for overreactions. I'm going to vote for Oregon to drop off of our island.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we have opportunity to see, because I was personally leaning Boise State only because that game got that was a seesaw. That arguably that was one of the games of the week. I mean, you could say the USC LSU game was great. You could say some of the others, but that was a seesaw battle. Boise State got ended up getting a 42-37 lead with 13 seconds after. I mean, it kept back and forth. I mean, it was a 56-45. Clearly, Boise State. Well, the best part of this, by the way, is they're going to play Oregon next week. So we have two teams that looked really weird and really shaky. I mean, Ashton Jeanty was as advertised. I mean, he went for 6 touchdowns in that game. But I'm curious to see how they stack up next week. I am leaning towards dropping Boise State off and then allowing next week's. Because the thing is, next week, we're going to get to revisit one of these teams. If Boise State manages to pull the upset we all kind of penciled in as a loss for them, oh my gosh, they're going to be back on this list. And we're going to just like Oregon, it was the first week. They were getting, acclimatized. I know Statesboro, Georgia Southern doesn't get enough appreciation for what kind of intensity they bring in that environment. So that was also kind of a factor there. But my goodness, I'm actually leading Boise State because I do not have a whole lot of faith about them now making it all the way, at least within their own conference, unscathed. I think there's going to be some challengers in that Mountain West, and they saw that Boise State has some serious problems, particularly on defense.
Well, there's 2 things I want to say. So, first of all, our voters didn't pick either of these teams as the team to kick out. Our voters, with 41.5% of the vote, picked Missouri as the team that they would kick out of the college football playoff contender list. So that makes it so one of us has to change our vote. Like, one of us has to decide, are we going to stick with the other, or are we going to move to Missouri instead as the team that we kick off? So the other thing that I'll say is that, look, it was weird. Like 56-45 against Georgia Southern. That's not great, man. Like, that's not great. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that that's great. At the same time, I have a lot of faith in Boise State figuring some stuff out defensively. Like, if the offense looked terrible and clunky, I would have been more concerned. But this is a defensive coaching staff. They have one of the best defensive players in the country in Ahmed Hassanian, right, on the defensive line. I think he's going to give Oregon some real hell next week. And like, I think you even look up and down this, you look up and down the stats, right? Like, Georgia Southern did finish with 461 yards, but like, their quarterback barely completed half his passes. Their running backs, they were under 4 yards per carry. This was just like a volume game in so many ways, right? Like, they just struggled to get off the field more than necessarily that they had troubles play to play with getting stops on the field. Like, Georgia Southern had 12 third down conversions. They were 12 of 19 on third down. To me, like, I'm not that worried about it. Like, they went on the road. They played more of a peer team in Georgia Southern than, of course, Oregon did. The reason that I lean Oregon is because, like, I just think that this team, like, you can't be in this situation where you're playing fourth quarter games and getting your defensive line or your offensive line bashed in by a Big Sky team. You just can't have this much hype. You can't have this much credit and have the issues that they had. And the other case that I'll make to knock out Oregon or Missouri instead of Boise State is that there is at least one team from the power conferences who I think deserves to be voted into the field. If we only vote out Boise State, we don't get to have a chance to vote that team in.
That's an interesting point because when I was thinking about Boise State, I don't know if I have another another G5 team I'm willing to step up in their place. Sure. I don't know if I have that. And with Mizzou, I really have problems with voting Mizzou off. I mean, they absolutely clobbered Murray State. They scored 4 touchdowns in the first 12 minutes. They were like 28-0 before it was ever anything. And then they outgained the Racers. Like I looked it up, they about like 490 yards to 85. I mean, that is the kind of just total domination you expect with a home tune-up game against an FCS team. And granted, Murray State ain't great. They're certainly not Idaho even preseason, but maybe that's it. Maybe
well, think of it like this. Okay, so we're going to consider 2 teams to be voted into the field. Don't necessarily think of it as, did Missouri do anything wrong to be voted off? Think of it, do they have a better case to be in the field than either USC or Tennessee, the 2 teams that we will be considering?
And that's kind of where I was going. I think Oregon has now, I look at that schedule, that Ohio State game really looks ominous now. At first it was like, I could see Oregon maybe winning once or twice and because they're expected to meet again. Now I'm not sure if they will meet again because, gosh, those folks at Oregon State watch that game. They're going to have them in 2 weeks after Boise State. Civil War is chaos and upsets happen. They're going to be looking at things. That game with Michigan, we'll see. That game at Wisconsin and the finale, because Washington, I peeked at them. They did what they were supposed to against Weber State. So, yeah, I think you've actually kind of got me here of the teams we have, because we're crazy here at the College Football Survivor Show. Let's go ahead and eliminate Oregon for now. They're going to have to play themselves back in.
I'm sure that's going to get us absolutely no complaints or emails or anything that we knocked Oregon out after week 1 so that we could keep Boise State in the field. But this is one of the fun things, right? First of all, we'll still get to talk about this game on Thursday's show because there is one college football playoff contender in the matchup this weekend, being Boise State. But the other thing, too, is that if Oregon comes out and really takes care of business, and by the way, I think in the case of both of these teams, Oregon and Boise State, there was some real look ahead, I think. I think that there was some real, this week 2 game is going to be a lot. We don't want to give too much away. And maybe they find themselves in a little bit more chaos in their week 1 matchups than they expected because they thought that they could maybe just not take it all that seriously. Well, guess what? That's not going to be the case week 2. I'm really interested to see whether Boise State and Oregon are able to kind of have that big time competitive game.
Talking about just real quick, somebody should look at this Georgia Southern head coach, Clay Helton. Maybe he should get a job at a P4 team somewhere. Oh my goodness. Because again, it is amazing. There's this, and it was written by a business professor in semi-humorous fashion, but I think it applies. There's a thing called the Peter Principle, where you keep getting promoted until you're incompetent at a job. And I wonder if Clay Helton is perfect as a G5 head coach or great as a G5 head coach, but handing him the keys to a program like USC just wasn't a perfect fit. I mean, we've seen plenty of G5 coaches where they do excellent and then they move to another program. In his case, obviously, he was actually a coordinator before he became a head coach. But man, I just wonder that. But enough on that.
I will say he does have 2 losing seasons in his first 2 years at Georgia Southern. So I don't necessarily want to overrate the idea of what Clay Helton even is at the G5 level. Let's let him get through this season and we can come back and evaluate. But look, for most of these college football coaches, that is the case, right? And we'll kind of figure out is him finding his level being a good G5 coach? Is it being a really good associate head coach or coordinator? Anyway, we don't need to have Clay Helton discourse on this timeline, yeah, especially, by the way, when there's much more interesting USC topics to talk about.
Yeah, so now that we've agreed to move Oregon off the island, we're going to have to figure out who to replace him with. So as you said, we've got Tennessee, who had a shutout. Not shutout. They were able to smash Chattanooga 69-3, and that was again what you'd expect in a matchup between a SEC school and a tune-up FCS squad. But USC had the bigger matchup last night here in Las Vegas. It was a game where, and I'd love to hear your impressions on it. For me, just watching it, first of all, that opening drive I thought set the tone because LSU received. USC at first started to just let them move forward. It felt like, okay, you're kind of getting ready. You're kind of putting the narrative in your head. And it's like, okay, USC mostly back to its old antics. But then they held firm and stopped them on fourth down, fourth and goal. And again, once again, the LSU defense, we were curious how they were going to do. They managed to hold USC to a punt. So the game started slow, certainly not as high scoring affair as people expected. The pivotal moment for me, and I know I'm not alone on this, but as I was watching the game, actually, I should say Lincoln Riley agreed in his post-game presser, was in that fourth quarter where LSU had taken the lead. They were at that point, it was 17-14. And they got the ball back after just an ugly set of downs for USC. They turned it over on downs. It was an opportunity for LSU to go and put a go-ahead touchdown, which would have felt, not go-ahead, but just adding to that lead, it would have felt insurmountable for USC. And out of nowhere, that USC defense, which normally would have been collapsing, had a 3 and out. And the ball went back to USC. Miller Moss, for a moment, went on fire again. In 3 plays, they were back in the end zone and took that 20-17 lead. There was a little bit of a seesaw exchange of points afterwards, but the confidence USC had at that point was remarkable. Again, I know that the USC defense in the post-game press, some of the players were like, we can still improve. We weren't great, but we feel a lot more confident. They actually, the comment they all said is Danton Lynn just made things feel a lot more relaxed. So they said, I'm not sure what Alex Grinch's coaching philosophy was. A lot of people wonder. But at the same time, they said they were a lot more comfortable. They were coming together. And it looked that way because that confidence had been missing at USC for a while. I mean, they no longer had Caleb Williams as this massive Band-Aid trying to cover him. And also, to be fair, the offensive line looked a little bit better too, because it's not like I want to believe, and here's the problem with the opening game. I remember what Miller Moss and Nussmeier looked like in their bowl games. They looked good. And I mean, Moss looked insane in his particular bowl game with 6 touchdowns. Only one yesterday. What happened? No. But at the same time, I want to say these offenses are still pretty good. I mean, USC's receivers were phenomenal. There was that Kyron Hudson one-handed catch that I remember, everyone, including the press box, everyone goes like, oh, it's just one of those plays that transcends the sport. But so I don't want to because we talked about this in one of our previous episodes, teams that could implode through the season. And I said whoever loses. You said whoever wins this particular game in Vegas. So it is possible that USC could be revealed to be fool's gold once we see how LSU develops. But yeah, man, pound your fist like Chip Kelly. It looks like Lincoln Riley may have a team right now.
Well, and this was the thing, is that it's obviously always hard to tell, especially coming out of week 1. But I felt like this game looked more like 2 good teams playing well than it was that one just collapsed. And look, there were a lot of yards in this game. 450 for USC, 421 to LSU, but nothing came all that easy. I thought that both defenses overall played pretty well, with USC's, like you mentioned, kind of stepping up and meeting the moment. We talked about the addition of D'Anton Lynn all offseason. We talked about the addition of Matt Entz as the head coach of the defense, Doug Belk as defensive backs coach, Eric Henderson as defensive line coach. And I think for USC, the biggest thing that I saw was this was a defense that, one, I think tackled at a much higher level. They wrapped up and tackled much better. 2, they rallied to the ball at a much higher level than I think that we've seen from USC in previous years. Now, Alex Grinch's previous system, they called it a speed D, right? And it asked a lot of their DBs, especially, to be out on islands and to go and cover the field and try to keep everything in front of them. And if they miss one tackle, that's game, basically, right? This is not how D'Anton Lynn is going to run his team and run his defense. It's going to be a lot more rallying. It's going to be a lot more getting guys and keeping them in front of them and trying to have multiple players rally to the ball in a way that I don't think we saw last year. And I think you got to give a lot of credit to both these quarterbacks. Miller Moss and Garrett Nussmeier both had some dimes in this game. And, yeah, you got great receivers too. I don't want to pretend like you don't, but like at the same time, I mean, Miller Moss completed 75% of his passes. Like he averaged more than 10 yards per pass attempt. And a lot of the stuff was downfield. It wasn't just yards after catch.
Oh, yeah.
It was impressive.
And that's what Nussmeier impressed me about. He was doing a lot of because USC, their defense was, at first I was concerned because they were playing to prevent the deep ball. It was obvious they were playing to prevent the deep ball. So Nussmeier was checking down and just getting to his receivers midway through the field and just getting chunks of yards that were, I thought, going to make them unstoppable against this USC defense. But it turns out that, there was method to the madness. They were able to corral them a little bit. One thing is both teams, especially in that first half, were doing a great job of corralling the run. I didn't expect that, especially with USC. That was a real major issue for them. At halftime, they were averaging, each team was within, I think LSU was averaging 3.5 per run and USC 3.4. And then LSU seemed to make tweaks because suddenly John Emery started to burst through and made some great plays. I remember by the end of the game, they were up to about 5.6. But then, and USC's run game just wasn't getting it going, so a lot was falling on Moss. I mean, every time they'd hit that line, it just seemed like they would get a couple of yards. By the fourth quarter, USC was down 2.1 yards per carry on the rush. But then, just like that, Woody Marks burst it through to score the go-ahead touchdown. I know he was happy about that because he's one of those transfers. He's a Mississippi State guy. It was he thought, people asked him what was it like being LSU, and you could see the SEC guy in him kind of come out and smile. He's like, it was great, But yeah, I don't know that. But to be fair, that's a problem. Watching the USC secondary and how they're preventing it, I could see them lose that method because, if a good quarterback can take advantage of that. And again, it's probably big credit to a lot of the guys LSU is bringing back, but the running game was still a bit iffy for the Trojans, and that could be a huge problem down the line.
So, should USC be added to our list of playoff contenders?
Well, if I'm comparing it against Tennessee at this point, and it's only based on resume, I'm going to assume LSU is a competent SEC team. I mean, again, because it's week one, we have to kind of we have to have a little bit of faith. And what I saw from LSU was a team that could potentially, if not, I'm not. Don't worry, I'm not penciling them in to win at this point, the entire conference. But they could fight their way back in and be a solid SEC team, especially with what I saw from Nussmeier and what I saw just across the board. Sometimes you just lose these games. Tennessee, again, beating up Chattanooga, about what you'd expect, but it isn't enough to impress me. Next week, they play the game that we're all looking forward to against North Carolina State.
A playing game to our playoff fields.
The two teams we're very curious about even before the season. We've talked about that. It's going to be played in Charlotte. Should be a great one. So I'm going to hold off on Tennessee for now. I think like Boise State and Oregon, which who knew it could be a playing game for a FBS program, for a P4 program. Yeah, I'm gonna go with USC for now. But I would tack them at the very bottom because I still feel like a little concerned. Maybe we've been bit too much by USC kind of falling apart, which is kind of a trademark, I don't know, of the team in the last couple of decades, especially after Pete Carroll. I'm hesitant, but I'm not sure who would be a better candidate at this point.
So let's just touch on Tennessee real quick. They beat Chattanooga 69-3. And yes, of course, they did kind of what you'd expect of them against an FCS opponent, but I think that they did overperform even what you might expect against an FCS opponent. Nico, I mean, he's one of those ones right now, right? Like he was incredible. 22 of 28, 314 yards, 3 touchdowns. And by the way, he only played the first half. So pretty damn good. The thing I'll also say, I covered an offense that was very similar to this at Baylor in the mid-2010s. And this is an offense that when you have talent advantages, it's literally impossible to stop. It is literally just you're screwed. You might as well not even show up if you're overmatched playing against an offense like this. It doesn't always translate exactly the same way than once you play similar talent or more talented teams. You can still have success. Just what happens here isn't necessarily emblematic of that. So all that to say, I still think that we should be in wait and see mode on them. They are legitimately a top 15 team to me. They are legitimately right on the cusp. If they win against NC State next week, they will be in our field 100%.
I just have to ask you, how do we compare the performance we saw of, because here's the problem where it gets hard to compare. Tennessee, being up Chattanooga, and Ole Miss just obliterating Furman 76-0, because that's another game where we saw Jackson Dart, another potential Heisman candidate, absolutely go on fire for that first half and was no longer needed afterwards. I mean, that's the problem with comparing these. It's like, wow, they looked great too. But again, I can't compare these two side by side because I'm assuming, the more we talk about that, the more Oregon seems all the more kind of like, okay, yeah, maybe you guys need a break from being a contender just for the time being until you figure out what you're at. Because these are the types of results we expect. We expect a team like Oregon to just go out and crush them. Even if it had been just especially maybe not a G5 playoff contender, but if it just been a mediocre G5 team like Alabama taking out Western Kentucky, we expect those kinds of results. So that really is why you've sold me, man. That Oregon result just seems like we need more time to think about you.
I think that if you are playing a team that's overmatched, whether it's an FCS or a really low end G5, then you need to, there's really nothing positive to me that can be taken away from that game, right? You're supposed to do this. Now, I think that Tennessee, I think that Chattanooga, there is more disparity even than, for example, with a team like Idaho. That's not a bad FCS team. Like, they're a very good FCS team, but you shouldn't have these problems. I'll even point to, for example, Oklahoma State, who's a team that we go a little back and forth on, especially heading into the season. They played the team, South Dakota State. They won 44-20. Like, beating them by 24 points is, like, that says something about you, I think. But that's what you're supposed to do, right? Ollie Gordon, 100 yards. Alan Bowman, 3 passing touchdowns. This is a pretty good defense. So, like, that's what I expect when you play a lesser team, a lower conference team. And the only way that we're going to take anything from it is if you don't do that.
Yeah, I just want to add one quick note, and I should have credited both these FCS opponents. They were ranked almost back to back. Chattanooga was like number 8 in the FCS poll, and Furman was number 9, and they were ranked above Boise State, probably above Idaho.
Were they really? I don't think I realized that, actually.
So that makes it even more alarming about what happened with Idaho. Probably what happened with Oregon and Idaho, doesn't it? I mean, my goodness. Because again, you expect that, especially when you play a fully loaded team. Again, maybe we would have, had it been those two teams against a weaker G5, maybe we would have seen a line like we did with Montana State and New Mexico. But yeah, no, those were not the teams we expected that with. And I love talking about this. I get so excited about it. So again, just to review, we took Oregon off. Yes. And we had one spot left, and we're deciding to put USC back on. So I'm
going to take us to the voters real quick. 60% of the vote, 59.4% of the votes is for yes. So the voters in Bobak put USC into the field before I even get a vote. But I would have also voted for USC to make the field.
I just took it from the way you were talking. I took the implication, especially after you said, like, how can he even if you beat an FCS, it's a lose-lose. It's either you have to clobber them or you look embarrassing.
Yep. So Tennessee, really close votes, 51.5% no. So we're all on the same page here. USC is the team that should come in.
Could I just say the other team I would have considered, although I don't think we've seen enough to put them out there, is Iowa, only because they displayed something resembling an offense this last game. I mean, let's let the Cyhawk chaos happen. I know you penciled in somebody's going to get embarrassed in this game, and who knows how, because that's just the way that game is. But I was in the back of my head now, because if they can put together, again, just a competent offense, suddenly you've got problems potentially in the Big Ten with a schedule that's weak.
Didn't we just have a whole conversation about how beating up on an overmatched opponent doesn't actually tell you anything? By the way, let's take a look back at the Stats Perform FCS Top 25. Okay, number 21, Illinois State. That's who Iowa beat 40-0. So I'm assuming a team that beat number 20, 45-3, we'd really have to consider strongly to get into the field. That would be my Baylor Bears against Tarleton. So no, we're not quite there with needing to have an Iowa conversation. But I will say I do know what you mean. I think that second half they started to find something. That they were only up 6-0 at halftime. But Cade McNamara, like, he just needed to shake off some rust. I think that in that second half, it wasn't always pretty, but he showed some stuff that I think they can really build on. So while I need you to get a grip a little bit, I do think that Iowa is a team that deserves just a little bit of respect for figuring a little bit out. But
you say that. My dream of that Iowa-Rutgers Big Ten Conference Championship is alive. It is alive, sir.
It's alive. It's alive. I think that also this week 2 could quietly have huge playoff implications because we have NC State versus Tennessee. We have Iowa versus Iowa State. I've talked about it before. I think that could be a game that has huge implications for the Big 12's second college football playoff spot in the same way that NC State's could for the ACC. We have Texas versus Michigan. I think that if Michigan wins that game, I feel a lot more comfortable with the idea that the Big Ten is going to get 4 teams in instead of 3. And by the way, USC jumping up and beating LSU in week 1, I think that also makes that pathway just a little bit more manageable than it was before. And this is one of the exciting things, right? Like, there was this complaint that, oh, well, the regular season won't matter. These games won't matter if you expand the college football playoff. But I actually think that you look at some of these games like NC State, Tennessee, like Iowa versus Iowa State, they're more valuable than they arguably ever have been before.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got me just thinking real quick. Looking into next week, one of the top 10 matchups that I have really kind of, I don't know, maybe I read too much into the first week, but I do not have a lot of hope for Michigan when Texas comes to town at this point. I mean, that Fresno State game felt a little close, and granted, we're talking about that Fresno State's always kind of a background contender in the G5. It's their very nature and who they are. But I'm not sure. I think Texas looked really good against UTEP, and granted, UTEP had a new head coach, exciting new head coach, but it's still the first game and against the playoff contender from last season. That's a game that lost a lot of its luster. Oh, and I just have to ask, what did you think of Drew Aller?
I don't even think it's what did I think of Drew Aller. I think it's what did I think of Andy Kotelnicki coming in and making the game easy and manageable for Drew Aller. Penn State looked really good. Penn State looked really, really good. And it's not just the fact that they were able to move the ball and put up points. While that's helpful, they unveiled some wide receivers. I'm looking especially at Harrison Smith III that I did not think that they'd have. Almost all of their top receivers were homegrown kids who have been in the program for 3 or 4 years. And we didn't see the vision from them last year. They didn't play all that well in the previous offense, but they have talent. Right? I mean, this has been a program that's put out receivers pretty consistently. And it looks like Harrison Smith III is going to be their next one. And I think this is actually a good transition into our next topic.
Yeah, so when we come back from the break, we are going to have a conversation about some of the quarterbacks and who we thought had some great performances in week 1 and some of the breakout stars of it here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
So yeah, again, great first week for a lot of offenses. Maybe not Oregon, but a lot of teams put up some great numbers. And we saw some quarterbacks who didn't even have to play second halves, just kind of house teams that, as we've talked about, may not have been up to the caliber of the opponents they're going to see later on in the season. But I'd love to hear from you. Like, how do we even break that? Like, who are your quarterback contenders and based on performances here in week 1?
Well, I think that there's kind of this mix like we were talking about with the FCS versus FBS, right? Like, so a player like Nico, like, you have to give him a lot of credit, but you also have to weigh the fact that it came against an overmatched opponent. Whereas maybe you give a little bit more credit to a player like Drew Aller, who played against a pretty decent opponent, went on the road, had a big game. So I think that we can kind of be in this position, in this situation, where we're kind of like, okay, the big numbers are nice, but I personally give a little more credit to doing it against a good opponent. And so I think from my perspective, that's how I approached it. Do you want to start at the bottom and work our way to the top potentially?
Yeah, let's do that. So, how many are we ranking here?
We're going to rank all 12 of the college
Mm,
football playoff contender
oh,
teams.
right. My goodness. So,
I can take it. I can kind of help guide us
yeah, I
through
was
this.
gonna say, like, I was actually thinking to myself, I didn't actually pay attention. Ashton Jeanty stole the entire show
Well,
for Boise State, so they may be the easy one, and I'm not sure if that's even fair. I actually don't even know who the quarterback is off the top of my head anymore. Oh yeah, he beat. No, I know this. Maddox.
yes, Maddox Madsen.
Yes.
He was my number 12, and he actually played pretty well. 22-31, 280, touchdown, interception. They had a wide receiver in Cameron Camper who stepped up and had 99 yards for them. And by the way, the return of Chris Marshall, I don't know if people remember Chris Marshall, started at Texas A&M, transferred to Ole Miss, kind of got run off from both places, spent a year in JUCO, showed back up. He's back now at Boise State. I think that he could have potentially an impact for them down the road. But look, the rest of the field was just too good. Like the rest of the field in week 1 was just too good, in my opinion. And so I had him number 12 on my list of in my ranking of the contenders.
Yeah, I think that's a fair bet. Well, who did you have above him? Because now let's get into those P4 contenders.
Yes. With my my next to last place. Come on, Will Howard. I needed to see more than that. It was not good in week 1 for Will Howard. Now, 228, 3 touchdowns. Technically, he completed 61% of his passes, but he started real slow. Was missing guys left and right, was not putting the ball in good positions. This game was frankly competitive for way longer than it had any right to be. And a lot of it was like passing game was just not very good. Like it just wasn't very good. And I mean, even Will Howard had to play into the fourth quarter to kind of just find some rhythm with these receivers. It was a disappointment to me. I think that some of the biggest question marks that I had about Ohio State and their quarterback situation came true in this game. Like I just don't know if they're fully ready for this, to be quite honest. And again, they're gonna have time to improve over the course of the season, but this was just about as bad of a Will Howard debut as I could have thought. And I'm gonna be curious how much he's able to improve versus how much does a player like Julian Sayin or Devin Brown start to factor into the equation.
Oh, interesting. And that was the thing. I mean, the takeaway from the Oregon State offense was more just the Jeremiah Smith showing up and looking like he's going to be as great as everyone hopes he's going to be. But yeah, no, Howard kind of fell into the background on that one. I think that's a good call. This is a tough list. I have to say that because now they kind of. I'm trying to think who are the other
There's a big
outliers.
jump now. There's a big jump now for sure.
Because the rest of them will cluster together quite a bit here. Mostly based on opponents, mostly based not. It might be easier almost to talk about who the best performer was at this point because it might be easier to work our way down because I'm trying to think quality. I mean, because how do we balance this? Again, is it because they kick butt against an FCS program or that they put together a performance against defenses that were supposed to be harder than most? And again, like week 1 is what it is. Do you go with someone like, I mean, I love how, by the way, okay, wait, I have to ask. So we talked about this right before the break. Andy Kotelnicki is who you're giving credit for that Drew Aller performance. Where did you put him? Did you put him in the middle of all of this?
I did put him in the middle. I did have him a little closer to the middle, but let's touch on the top real quick because it gives us a chance to talk about what I think was an extremely funny game.
Go for it. I got to hear this.
Miami absolutely kicked the crap out of Florida. That was hilarious. That was one of the funniest games that I've ever seen. Not just because Florida couldn't hang. Well, that's still funny, but like Miami just made it look so easy. Like those first couple of drives in the game when Cam Ward was just like jogging to the sideline, that was so disrespectful. That was crazy. He was just like walking out of bounds, like, y'all can't even catch me. Yeah, I can't even do anything. The thing that I loved about it, now he had a bad interception. I do want to say, like a really, really bad interception. And he's got to be a little better about not floating because he will have time in this pocket. He's not used to having time coming from Incarnate Word and then Washington State. He's got to get used to having time in this pocket. But 26 and 35, 385, 3 touchdowns and interception, also 33 on the ground, completely just obliterated Florida in every phase. And they knew they couldn't touch him. Now, the receivers deserve some credit, especially Xavier Restrepo, but Cam Ward was the breakout star of this game. I thought that he had a chance to be pretty special. And I think for them, going on the road, playing an in-state opponent, and winning the way that they did, they didn't beat as good of a team as some of the others did, of course. But I think that Cam Ward was the breakout star of week one.
Compare that to Carson Beck. How do we think, I mean, because granted, Clemson is going to be dealing with some interesting questions right now, but and too bad, I know Coach Swinney has stopped taking calls, but the text line is open. So Tyler from Spartanburg, be sure to send your texts. But I mean, what do you think about Beck? Because he's been one of the Heisman favorites going into this season, and he put together a solid performance against Clemson in Mercedes-Benz.
Yeah, I had him number 3 on my list. And I think that it was a tale of two halves in some ways for Carson Beck, but also for Georgia. I don't think that some of the early struggles were his fault. I think that their play calling left just a little bit to be desired at times. But I do think that, I mean, he showed he's one of the most efficient pocket passers that we've seen, not just this year, but of the past couple of years. 23 to 33, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. He was playing against a really good defense too. Clemson has some of the best DBs in the country, and he was able to still find angles and opportunities for them. I thought that this was an encouraging debut for Carson Beck. Not enough to stack him near the top necessarily. Like I didn't think that it was necessarily that good, but it was enough for me to feel pretty good overall about what he is and where he is.
Well, this begs a question then. Who's your number 2?
My number 2 is Miller Moss. I think that he was really good in his, I guess, full season starting debut as USC's quarterback. It wasn't just necessarily that he was hitting passes. And I want to be clear, like Lincoln Riley makes stuff happen as an offensive play caller. So, maybe some of these other guys they were put in this situation could have done the same thing, but it wasn't necessarily just the decisions he was making. It was like how pinpoint his throws are. It was how direct. It was how on target they were. They got there with zip. Like he just did everything right yesterday. And it's kind of funny that he only finished with 1 touchdown because his passes set up so many of their scoring drives, right? Like I think that people, especially on the LSU side, were like, well, Nussmeier has 2 touchdowns, Moss has 0 at this point. But I thought that was a little bit of a misread of how the game was going. Like they rushed for 2 of their touchdowns because of passes that Miller Moss threw to help set things up for them. So I think that overall, I mean, Cam Ward was the breakout star. I think that Miller Moss is right there with him when it comes to players just playing absolutely incredibly. And so overall, I think that he still has a really good case to be number 2.
And that's a legitimate rating only because that is part of the reason why USC is now on the list. That's why they're in the part of the survivor group, because great play. I mean, again, not just Miller Moss. It was that defense. We'll see, but still, they were able to play themselves into it. So I think that's a great pick. Where did you put Quinn Ewers in all of this? Because he had a great performance. I mean, by the time I tuned in, Arch Manning was in. So what do we think of that? Or are we just putting Arch Manning in? No, yeah, I'm just kidding.
Always a good indicator. Always a good indicator when you tune in and the backup is in the game. So I will say, Nico, I put at number 4. He played against an FCS opponent, but like as good of a debut as you're ever going to see. And I will say I had Jackson Dart number 7, a couple spots behind, even though their lines were pretty similar overall. I just give a little more credit to Nico because it was his first real start. And so, I mean, just the dominance was just unbelievable. And also, when you look at the quality of throws that he was making, that was just enough for me to put him there on the list. I had Ewers number 5, though. And even though they were playing against Colorado State, an overmatched opponent, this was, I think, a really impressive performance from Ewers for one particular reason. and it was his red zone passing. That was a huge issue for Texas last year. In fact, I would argue that that was their fatal flaw last year, was their red zone issues. And Quinn Ewers kind of helped put that to sleep this time around. He had his touchdown passes were 11 yards, 7 yards, and 1 yard. I thought that the receivers did a really good job of creating space for themselves, and Ewers was able to deliver in a big sort of way. Again, we're going to learn a lot more about Quinn Ewers after they play Michigan this upcoming week, but I had Ewers number 5. And at number 6 is where I had Drew Aller after coming in and playing really well. I think that there was an argument for him to be a little higher than this, but this is a building block. This is a first look, and I think that Aller belongs at number 6 with Dart at number 7.
I do want to ask about another quarterback, one who came back from injury, and that's Cam Rising, because Utah, again, FCS opponent, Southern Utah is not matched well against the Utes. But in his return after a full season off, after that horrible injury in the Rose Bowl, he's here, and he was a major factor in Utah with the 5 touchdown performance. How did you put him, or did he make your list? Because I noticed we've included Nico, and the Tennessee isn't in our survivors. So I mean,
that was a mistake on my part. I prepared for both, actually. That's a mistake on my part. Okay, so let's strike Nico from the list, actually. So that would give us Cam Ward at 1, Miller Moss at 2, Carson Beck at 3, Quinn Ewers at 4, Drew Aller at 5, Jackson Dart at 6, and so I had here's where it kind of gets interesting. So number 7, I have Riley Leonard, and Riley Leonard didn't have like an amazing game, but I think that what stood out to me was that he had a very impactful game because of his ability in the quarterback run game. He was able to come in against a really, really good Texas A&M front that, by the way, was kind of whipping their offensive line. And he was just able to make things happen. I think that Texas A&M ended up with 7 tackles for loss, but only one of them was a sack because Riley Leonard was able to keep plays alive. And I think that you could make the case the reason that Notre Dame wins that game is because of Riley Leonard's dual threat ability. Now, he didn't pass the ball well at all. 30 passes, only 158 yards. That's not going to cut it. But Texas A&M is also probably the best defense that Notre Dame is going to play all year. And I think that just that playmaking ability, I think back to, I think back to a player like Ian Book that was at Notre Dame. And Ian Book, nobody mistook him for being like a Heisman contender necessarily, but he was able to take them to playoffs because of his playmaking ability, because he just kept plays alive and made things happen in a way that Sam Hartman couldn't last year, that Jack Cohn couldn't the year before that. I think that Leonard brings that back. And at number 8, I have Jalen Milroe. Jalen Milroe, he was able to play pretty well for Alabama. I mean, look, the passing was a little bit of a mixed bag at times. He only had a handful of completions. Let me pull up his line real quick. He was 7 of 9, but 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. I think that performance was a lot more about the receivers playing well.
Exactly. We had the freshman Ryan Williams just getting 2 touchdowns, and once again, like Ohio State, we had. But it's interesting. That's a bit of a difference because I mean, we kind of we're talking about Will Howard not being a factor in that game, and how Jeremiah Smith walked up and kind of stepped up. Here we have a game with Jalen Milroe, again, someone with a lot of expectations after being a Heisman finalist last season, or at least in that picture, in that top contenders, over a little bit overshadowed by the freshman wide receiver.
No, I agree, but even outside, I think that especially like the thing that was just the receivers doing stuff was Ryan Williams with that 84-yard touchdown, right? Like that was just a crazy play. And also, by the way, a huge breakdown from Western Kentucky to let that happen. But he did have a 22-yard passing touchdown to Kendrick Law. He had a really nice touchdown to Ryan Williams. And by the way, he also added 79 and 2 touchdowns on the ground. So he finished with 5 total touchdowns in this game. I thought that, look, we didn't know whether Alabama was still going to be the death machine heading into the Kalen DeBoer era, just even stylistically. But I thought that Jalen Milroe, like, he had 19 total touches and finished with 5 touchdowns. That's not too bad. I think that's going to do. And Western Kentucky is obviously overmatched but to beat them the way that they did, I think it still said something. And then let's get to Cam Rising. Let's get to Cam Rising. So Cam Rising, they're playing against Southern Utah. Not the greatest of the FCS opponents that we've talked about on this list. I don't believe that they're ranked, but I'm screwed myself with the with underrating some of the teams on this list so far. So I don't, with Chattanooga especially. So I don't want to speak out of line. But Cam Rising, 10 of 15, 254, 5 touchdowns. I mean, that'll do, right? I think that he showed what he needed to show in this game. One thing that was a little funny was that I believe all of his touchdowns were not to wide receivers. That's not like I wish we could have gotten a wide receiver touchdown in this game, but it was 3 to tight ends and 2 to running backs in this game. I ding him for that just a little bit because I think that you're just leaning on all reliable against an opponent in Brant Kuithe that can't hang with Brant Kuithe. But to be ninth on this list, we talked about some of the best quarterback performances in the country. This is not a knock, I think, against Cam Rising's performance. He's going to have an opportunity in the coming weeks, I think, to really establish himself. And seriously, they're going to host Baylor this week, and Baylor looked pretty improved on the defensive side in week 1. If he continues to do this, right, if he continues to score 4 or 5 touchdowns against Baylor, against Oklahoma State in a couple of weeks, against Arizona, that's going to help him move up my list. But I didn't learn a lot from the tight ends really cooking against Southern Utah.
I have to say, I had to look it up. So Southern Utah, they were picked 3rd in their conference. And then I had to look up what conference? The United Athletic Conference.
Oh,
which
they're
is
part
new.
of that.
They're the merger.
Oh,
They're the merger of the WAC and the
A-10.
Atlantic Sun. Yeah. So they were ranked 3rd, and they got no first place votes against Tarleton State, who played, of course, the Baylor Bears, and Central Arkansas, which had actually they were threatening at one point in their game. So yeah, those were the two. Those were the two leaders. But yeah, Southern Utah, not quite, but not terrible, but not quite, but also not enough to give us a read. So that leaves us Brady Cook, who is going to come in at number 10.
Yes, Brady Cook will come in at number 10. He didn't do anything wrong, right? He didn't do anything wrong. He just didn't have that notable a game. And on a day where a lot of the other quarterbacks had crazy stat lines during their not that notable a game, I don't know. You didn't score 5 touchdowns. Brady Cook, Cam Rising, and Jalen Milroe did. You didn't beat Texas A&M with your running game. So that's really all. It's not a whole lot more to be read into it than, hey, Brady Cook had a nondescript game when everybody else had slightly better nondescript games.
Absolutely. So just to kind of run down our list, and this is Shehan's work because I admit, with a lot of this stuff and all of this travel, I didn't get a chance to see as many of Saturday's games. We have Cam Ward, Miller Moss, Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, not Nico Imaliava, but if he had been, he would have been part of there. Drew Aller, Jackson Dart, Riley Leonard, Jalen Milroe, Cam Rising in his return, Brady Cook, Will Howard, who again we'll see how it goes, but hope that maybe it's just they're too overloaded with talent at Ohio State to make use of him. And Maddox Madsen, the quarterback of Boise State. What a good list! I mean, nobody really was awful. I guess Will Howard was the worst in the sense that he just wasn't really a factor. But he could rise up. But is that? I mean, are we too early to kind of write him off? I mean, do we think there's Ohio State fans should not have buyer's remorse here? Because
no
buyer's remorse at this point.
He started to figure it out in the second half. And look, I mean, just the style of passing that he's coming from to what he's jumping into is so different. It's actually kind of ironic. His former offensive coordinator, Colin Klein, now at Texas A&M. And I think that you saw Connor Wegman deal with some of the same issues, right? This is an offense where with Kansas State before, where you are on the run a lot, you are moving a lot. So to sit there in the pocket and deal, that's just such a different kind of experience for a quarterback than what obviously you're going to do at Ohio State. And so it will be some adjustment. We started to see him become more comfortable in the second half and realize, hey, let me just give my awesome wide receivers a chance here. Let me not overthink it, not try to make something happen. I just have to not mess it up. And I think that Will Howard is more than capable of coming in and doing that. Yeah, by the way, to the listeners, I apologize for including Nico on my initial list. It is week 1 for all of us. We will be much more buttoned up. They always say you improve the most from week 1 to week 2, and I assure you we will do that.
Before we finish wrap this up, I just want to note Kyle McCord threw for 354 yards and a career best 4 touchdowns in his debut with Syracuse. So that'll be an interesting.
Did you see Fran Brown's quote after the game? He said,
No.
I should send Ryan Day a bottle of champagne for letting us have Kyle McCord.
Boy, oh boy, this is going to be that's going to be one of the side stories this season, is watching how those two quarterbacks develop across the season. Because there was a lot of questions there, and how much were they putting too much on McCord last season? And again, losing to Michigan is what it boiled down to a lot of ways. All right, well, this is a good show. It's week 1. It's exciting. So much more is coming up. Thank you all for joining us. This is the College Football Survivors show. We want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivors Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Irie, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Take care.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.